wasallam. Sisters, welcome to this lecture, which is the start of our program with the Sheikh Ali Al-Tamimi, our guest speaker from the States. The title for this lecture, as you are informed, is Feminism and Islam. The time for the lecture will be, inshallah, 45 minutes. There shall remain after that some 15 minutes for questions and answers. And further to that, after Salat al-Maghrib, which will take place at 4 o'clock, inshallah, after Salat al-Maghrib, the Sheikh will be available at his office for half an hour for your questions and answers over the telephone. Then you may ring him from the Sisters Prayers Hall over the phone, and he will be, inshallah, willing to answer your questions for half an hour after Salat al-Maghrib. Without further ado, inshallah, I'll leave the microphone to the Sheikh, who is, inshallah, well known to most of you. So I move, inshallah.
الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وبعد. As we heard, the lecture this afternoon is regarding feminism and Islam. And this lecture is one which I personally feel is quite important in that there is a concerted movement throughout the world to try to reinterpret basic Islamic beliefs and practices in light of an interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah which is would be called a feminist interpretation of Quran and Sunnah. And those who propagate these beliefs and arguments hold that their teachings does not deviate from what Allah sent His Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with, but in reality his teachings, or these teachings, are in perfect conformity with what Allah sent the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with. An example of a popular book which is widely available and widely read regarding this is a book by the author of a Moroccan lady by the name of Fatima Marnisi, who wrote a book in French which was then translated into English, The Veil and the Male Elite, a Feminist Interpretation of Women's Rights in Islam. And when one goes through the book, I mean, we really won't discuss it during this lecture, one finds it that it's really a collation of poor scholarship, and it raises a number of questions regarding what is her notion regarding the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and other matters dealing with faith, irrespective of her interpretations as to what are the rights to be given to women in Islam as according to the teachings of Islam. And also we find other concerted efforts, whether done on the international level, like through various agencies of the United Nations, or done just through the popular vehicles of transmission of ideas like newspapers and other forms of media. Now, we should understand that the notion of feminism is something relatively new in terms of the ideas of found amongst human beings. I mean, 4 centuries ago, there was no such thing as feminism. You wouldn't be able to find it in a dictionary, in an encyclopedia, in any sort of writing, irrespective of that writing proceeded from Muslims or from non-Muslims. Rather, feminism is a new school of thought that has appeared really in the last you might say the last 150 years, and in particular since World War II in the West. And for this reason, it behooves us to sort of look at how since this school of thought appeared amongst in the West initially, it behooves us to sort of understand how does the West look to women historically, and as this will give us an idea as to why did feminism sort of arise in the West. Well, if we look at Western civilization as a whole, Western culture as a whole, we find that it is basically rooted in a number of matters, one among foremost of which is the ideas of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. Much of Western culture and civilization is traceable to these notions held by the Greek philosophers be they Socrates or Aristotle or Plato and others. And when one looks as to how they looked at women, the ancient Greeks did not conceive of women as being full human beings. Rather, their notion was that women really did not possess full humanity like men do. And so therefore, women were mere objects to be bought and sold in the markets, and were not considered to be full human beings, fully sharing the quality of humanity, the essential quality which men and women do share. Then came the teachings of Christianity. The West adopted the teachings of Christianity in one form or another, and these teachings were not obviously the teachings which Allah sent down to the Prophet Isa alayhi salam, but rather were a mixture of the teachings of the rabbinical Jews, a mixture of pagan practices, and some of the ethical teachings which remained amongst the early Christians, which they preserved, not having lost. So it was a mixture of some of the truth which Allah sent down to the Prophet Isa alayhi salam, and also a mixture of some of the falsehood which was available. When one looks at rabbinical teachings regarding women, and this can especially be found in some of the essays written by the Apostle Paul, or who is known as Apostle Paul, who was originally a Jew, in the New Testament, one finds also a general degradation of women, and the notion that women were the cause for the fall of humanity. That when Adam alayhi salam ate of the forbidden fruit from the tree, the cause of this, according to the teachings in the Old Testament, was that Eve succumbed to the wishes of Satan, and she convinced Adam to transgress. And so therefore in Jewish theology, and thereafter in Christian theology, the idea of humanity falling from God's grace, and the whole idea of humanity, losing paradise, the blame of that, the sin of that, is put squarely on the shoulders of women alone. And so therefore you find major Christian authors throughout the Middle Ages referring to women as Satan's trap and as the cause of all suffering faced by humanity in the world. So these notions of that women essentially are not full human beings, that they're the cause of the pains and sufferings that human beings do find, that they are Satan's tool, and so forth, led to a very degraded view of women in the Middle Ages and in Europe and in Western civilization. Moreover, we find no examples of women having any sort of share in the political or social or intellectual life of these societies. In fact, even here in England, it was only until perhaps the 14th century, if my memory serves me correct, where it was permissible for even a woman to actually read the Bible. Prior to that, it was forbidden for a woman, according to church law, to even read the Bible, let alone have a copy, possess a copy. And of course, in Islamic history, we know that the original copy of the Quran made during the time of Abu Bakr was placed with Umar, and then after Umar's death was left with Umar's daughter, who was also the Prophet's wife, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Hafsa radiallahu anha. The point is that, so this sort of notion that women were inherently not full human beings, that they were degraded, continued in the West and was very much a part of the society. It was a notion that existed for a number of centuries. What happened was that during the 18th century and the 19th century, the West went through what was known as the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution primarily took place here in England. And as a result, there was a great need for a lot of labor to appear in the work in the different mines, to work in the different factories and so forth. And because of the shortage of sufficient men to do these tasks and the needs for industrialization, a large number of women and children were forced to work. And here, women would work for 12, 14, 16 hours, and children also for relatively no pay, if any at all. And as a result, a number of aristocratic women saw the plight of their fellow sisters, so they started to call for that a certain equality and justice be given in rights. And one of the first books written regarding that was in the 18th century or early 19th century, calling A Vindication for the Rights of Women. And basically the book argued, well, look, if women are going to be working 14 or 16 hours, they should be able to get a pay just like men do. And likewise, women should, in order to remove a lot of the social ills that the people were facing in England, women should have a right to be educated and to have a right to also participate in education and in learning and in culture and so forth, in order to raise the status that women were accorded in the Western society. Now, this in itself, I mean, there's no problem with it, and in reality, it's really a reflection of the state that women faced in this civilization, in this Western culture. However, what happened was that after World War II, you might imagine that the West being, of course, and this is just a general principle that one finds among non-Muslims, or even Muslims, when Muslims do not adhere to the Quran and Sunnah, they go from one extreme to the other. So the West went from the extreme of stripping from women their essential quality of humanity, considering them to be human beings, letting them to have rights like owning property, reading their scriptures, being educated, and so forth. They went to the other extreme after World War II, and to the extreme of arguing that women and men are basically the same, and that there's no difference between the two. And any differences that appear between the two are as a result of a teaching in the culture of the society, and that it is possible, if one was to be taught differently, that all the roles assumed by men could be assumed by women, and all the roles assumed by women can be assumed by men. And so therefore they start to even refer to, instead of calling them the sexes, male and female, they start to refer to a neutral term like gender. And again, one of the reasons which caused this was that during World War II, large numbers of women were forced to go to the factories to produce the airplanes and the tanks and so forth, because large numbers of men were conscripted. And then what happened was that after World War II, when it was over, a lot of these women were then forced to leave the workplace to allow for the returning men from war to have jobs, and so these notions start to become. And so therefore what we find today is that we find that, you know, feminism is not just a call to just that women are given, treated very fairly and given, recognize their essential humanity and so forth, but rather we find that, you know, feminism has grown to a whole school of thought. Indeed, there are a number of schools of thought within feminism. There's a liberal feminism, there is a Marxist feminism, there's a radical feminism as another school of thought. Also, there is a psychoanalytic analytic feminism, a socialist feminism, an existential feminism, a postmodern feminism. You know, schools and schools of thoughts, you know, within this. And if you look at the feminist approach to religion, you know, basically you find two approaches today in the West. One approach might be considered the apologetic approach. And you find this often amongst Christian feminists, and to some degree among Jewish feminists also. These people try to reconcile the religious beliefs with feminism. And in order to achieve this, they argue that it's necessary that they have to reinterpret their text, whether the Hebrew text in the Old Testament or the Greek text in the New Testament. They have to reinterpret it, taking into consideration the historical, grammatical, and literary context which these texts were written in. And so therefore, one very famous book of this type is a book by a lady called Virginia Mollenkott. She authored a book called Women, Men, and the Bible, where she argues this type of argument. And this, of course, is a minority view, I mean, that tries to reconcile religious teachings with feminist thought. The other type of thought here we might, as opposed to the apologetic thought, is the radical feminist thought, you might call it. And, you know, over here they consider that religion in its nature and in its essence is against women. And so therefore no religion, irrespective of what the religion, is positive for women, and that women must, you know, just reject, in order to be free, they must reject religion as a whole. For instance, one British author by the name of Rosalind Miles, in her book The Women's History of the World, writes regarding, for instance, the notion that, or the belief that, in Adam and Eve, which is shared in its basic fundamentals by Christians and by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But you find both in Islam and also you find in Judaism and Christianity. The basic idea that Allah created Adam and then created Eve from the rib of Adam, and from the two, humanity spread, and that they were originally in paradise and then they sinned and they came to earth. In terms of the very basic details, there was an agreement. Obviously, there is additions and corruptions in the beliefs of the Jews and the Christians due to the loss of the purity of their texts. And while we have greater detail and we have a preserved text with the Muslims, but the point is that in terms of the general issues, the general beliefs, they're in agreement. So this author, Rosalind Miles, in The Women's History of the World, she writes that regarding the belief regarding Adam and Eve, she says, she calls it a myth, and she says the Adam and Eve myth is possibly the single most effective piece of enemy propaganda, meaning by enemy male propaganda, in the long history of the sex war, and also has other crucial implications. It performed the essential task of putting man first in the scheme of things, for in all the father God religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, God creates man first and woman is born after man. And then she goes on saying that attacking this in details, really doesn't concern us now. But the point is, which I want to bring out, was that that she considered just the basic notion, which is a basic religious tenet for Muslims and also the other originally revealed scriptures of Jews and Christians, that that Allah created Adam and Eve. She considers this to be a myth, that it's a piece of enemy propaganda, that there's actually a sex war between the two sexes, and it has crucial implications. And so therefore, for this reason, you find that the radical feminists, in order to sort of fulfill the natural need that human beings have to worship, they have tried to revive the worship of female pagan deities. And for those of you who might have some sort of readings in these books, you find that they try to talk about the importance of reviving these female deities. And so therefore, the same author, Rosalind Miles, she looks at the coming of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as a struggle between a male god, Allah, and the female god, Uzza. Now, of course, we know from our basics of Tawheed that Allah Azza wa Jalla is the creator of human beings, and Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is not a man nor a woman, but rather He is the creator of men and women, and He is not like His creatures. But the point is, in fact, she thinks of the whole appearance of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, that it was a struggle between two of the women of Mecca, Khadija and Hind, and they were struggling for power in Mecca, and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, utilized that struggle when Khadija died in order to turn the tables upon the women as a whole in Arabia and put forward a male god by the name of Allah, and destroy the female goddesses. And so therefore, one of the things that she calls for is the revival of the worship of these pagan idols. And this is nothing unique to her. You find this also amongst other writings. For instance, a book entitled Sisterhood is Global, the International Women's Movement Anthology, which was edited by Robin Morgan. Also in the section of Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait, they call for the women there to revive the worship of Al-Uzza, and also to revive the worship of the other female idols that the pagan Arabs had. And in case, just to remind ourselves, the reason why I say female pagan idols, because the pagan Arabs used to think that Allah, the jinns were born from, or the angels were born from Allah and the jinns, and so therefore they described them as being the daughters of Allah, and they worshipped them, some certain sections of the pagan Arabs. Likewise, you find among women who attribute themselves to Islam, like Layla Ahmed, who wrote a book called Women and Gender in Islam, the Historical Roots of a Modern Debate, she becomes of great praise of the Sufi Ibn Arabi, and she feels that really that Ibn Arabi's teachings should be revived, and she calls for that. The reason why is because Ibn Arabi was among those Sufis who believed that everything was Allah. What's known as pantheism or monism. They believe that everything is Allah. So everybody is Allah. All things that we see, a person's shoes, a pen, a glass of water, everything is just a manifestation of a single existence which is identified by Allah. And so therefore, to them Allah is both male and female. So she finds in this some sort of a pleasure, and so therefore she calls that this. She says, to quote her, that on page 100, the notion of divinity in the female face was profoundly offensive to the orthodox, meaning to the regular Muslims. Ibn Arabi's emphasis on the female dimension of the divine and the complementary of the sexes was a consistent element in his thought. And then she says, concludes by saying, although a controversial figure, one subject to hostility during periods of his life, his intellectual power, as evidenced in his prodigious literature, has won him acknowledgement as a major Muslim thinker. So the point is that this movement, which grew in the West and has developed now into many different philosophical schools of thought, now basically has two positions toward religion. You have those who are apologetic, like the Christian feminists. You also have the radical feminists, which is probably the majority of the feminist movement today, who look at religion as something which is inherently evil against women, and that women should disbelieve and reject their religions, and that they should return to the worship of pagan idols, and turn to things like witchcraft and all these sort of fads, which are New Age religions, which are dominant in the West. And one finds that there was a very lengthy article that appeared in one magazine called, maybe it was the American Spectator, I'm not certain the name of the magazine at this point, but it appeared in 1992, which was entitled Feminism, Spiritualism, and a New Craze, the Twilight of the Goddess. And basically it talks about this idea and how people are trying to push this in the West and trying to really reinterpret history for that. Well, where does this all take us? We find that Muslims here are now also being influenced by the same notions, and so therefore, as I alluded to initially, you're finding that many voices which are calling for a feminist interpretation of Islam. And while there doesn't exist really many of the radical feminist school of thought, those who reject religion completely and call to the worship of pagan deities and idols and witchcraft and so forth. Although you find some of these voices, the majority of them, like Fatima Arnisi and others, try to argue that what they're really doing is they're bringing us back to the original Islamic teachings, and that men have misinterpreted Islam in order to further the male cause, and that they want to sort of sift through all this male interpretation and get to the true teachings that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ came with. Be that as it may, I mean, the intent of this lecture is not to really get into her arguments or others' specific arguments. What I'd like to do in the next, 20 minutes or so, is sort of outline some of the basic notions that Islam has regarding men and women, and from there we can see the difference if we understand the difference in the basic concepts and notions, then anything which comes from that, we don't have to really get into its details, because we can dismiss it based upon the general principles. And for this we have to start again by reviewing what the West considered originally women. As I mentioned, they did not consider women to fully share in humanity as males do. And this was based upon some of the philosophical teachings of the early Greeks. Well, in Islam we find the opposite. I mean, in Islam it's very clear from the Quran, and it's very clear from the text of the Prophet ﷺ, like especially the hadith where he said that indeed the women are the split half of men, that Islam views men and women as fully sharing in humanity. Islam does not teach, or never has Islam taught or has suggested, or Muslims have believed or held that women were less of a human being than men. And that, in other words, that there is, that the essential quality of what makes something a human being as opposed to being, a chimpanzee or a lizard or something like that. Those essential qualities, that men have more of that than women. I mean, this never, occurred in any Islamic school of thought. Even the most astray Islamic groups or, sects never argued towards that. But all Muslims have, because it's so clear in the Quran, and it's so clear. I mean, obviously, human beings recognize that by their natural. By their nature, that both men and human beings are both men and women are full human beings, and because both men and women are full human beings, as a result of that, you find that the major thrust of Islamic teachings, which is the notion of submitting to Allah and worshiping Allah alone, you find that these teachings are addressed to both men and women alike, in the sense that the basic pillars which would constitute the religion, whether the pillars of Islam, like the testimony of faith, like the prayer, like zakah, like fasting, like hajj, whether you talk about the pillars of iman, belief in Allah, the angels, the scriptures, the messengers, the last day, belief in qadar, whether the notion of ihsan, of perfecting one's worship, to worship Allah as if we were to see Him, even though we do not see Him in this world, He sees us. Men and women are addressed in this equally. And likewise, the reward which people seek from submitting Allah, and the benefits which they seek in this world and here, are also given equally to men and women. I mean, it's not like if a man makes prayers, he gets more reward than if a woman made her prayers. But no, rather Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us in the Quran that each would get his full reward. We are from one another. And so, therefore, this is a very important notion that the West, until recently, in the last 150 years or 200 years in its literature, never thought of men and women being full in their humanity. Second to that, in terms of the state of human beings, the condition of humanity, if you look at the Quran very clearly, the Quran does not suggest that the sin that was committed by Adam and Eve was the sin of Eve alone, and that Adam was like an unwilling partner, or he was duped into that. But rather, the Quran is very clear. I mean, the dua we find in Surah Al-A'raf that Adam makes, Adam speaks in plural. O Rabbana, ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا, O our Lord, we have wronged our own souls. And if you do not forgive us and have mercy upon us, then we will be among the losers. So, here you find Adam praying with Eve, both of them saying, making this dua, and equally, repenting for their sin. Likewise, the Quran in one passage in Surah Al-Taha says that, Adam disobeyed his Lord, and so he went astray. So, it made the cause of, Adam's sin fall upon Adam's shoulder. It didn't relieve Adam of the sin, as is suggested in some of the medieval teachings by Christian, theologians and philosophers. So, in that way, likewise, Muslims never thought of, women to be the cause of evil, or they have brought the evil unto men, and so therefore they're inherently something which should be, looked at with suspicion, or as inherently something which there's no good in. The third matter of great importance is regarding rights. Before I get to the matter of rights, however, though, and what Islam does recognize regarding men and women is that men and women are different. And difference here doesn't necessarily mean that one is better than the other. For instance, many of you might have memorized the passages, the first of the surah, Surah Al-Layl, in the last, the 30th part of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by night, وَاللَّيْلِ, and then he mentions it as the night covers, and then he talks about the day as it comes with its brightness, and then he says, and he who has created وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, and he who has created male and female. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions night and day, and then male and female. Could one argue that Islam teaches us that the day is inherently good and that night is inherently evil? Or, for instance, that the sun is inherently good and the moon is inherently evil, or vice versa? Or that the sky is inherently good and the earth is inherently evil? No, rather we find throughout the creation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this duality. And so therefore, just like we have night and day, sky and earth, moon and sun, we find male and female. This is one of the signs of Allah Azza wa Jal. Neither of the two can be considered evil. And likewise, however, they cannot be considered the same. And here's what the major difference is between contemporary Western thought and Islamic beliefs. The West went from the one extreme of denying women their humanity, stripping from them the notion that they are, full human beings, to the other extreme where they now try to argue that men and women are the same, that the only difference that why men act a certain way and women act a certain way is because the culture and the society teaches men to act this way and teaches women to act the other way. And that if one was to imagine that one could even teach, as I mentioned, for them to act in opposite roles. So, for instance, men would be more soft and gentle, and women would be very, strong and courageous and so forth, instead of the other. And any sort of difference that can be found in terms of physiology of male and females, they try to deny that difference has any effect upon the psychological or the mental disposition of the sexes. However, it's very clear, even scientific thought, even though it's considered to be scientific heresy, it's very clear from the scientific literature, if one looks at it, that that it's been shown that that the male physiology and the way leads, and the different hormones and so forth, leads to different ways of acting and different ways of reacting, and different parts of the personality, and female physiology leads to other and so forth. That does not mean that one is good and one is bad, but rather Allah Azza wa Jal, in His wisdom, in order for humanity to exist, has created these different things in order. And as a result, since there is a distinction between the two genders or two sexes, in the sense that they are not the same, they're not equal, so therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has discharged or has given different obligations to each of the sexes. Obligations which will fit each sex best according to the way it was created for the purpose that Allah wanted of it. And what any sex has a certain obligation placed upon it, it then entails, as a result of that, it has greater rights. And let me give you an example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His wisdom has decreed that the physical structure of men and the way they're created provides for them a greater ability for them to work, for them to go out in the world and do physical tasks, and to stuff which would activities which are necessary in order to develop economies and societies and so forth. And so therefore, since they are the ones who are engaging these tasks, and they're the ones who, in terms of human terms, would be bringing in the money and the commerce, so therefore they had the responsibility at the same to become in charge of the household, to take care of the household. And then the members of the household would then be under their administration, under their guidance and so forth. And so as part of since they had this obligation, they achieved a right, that this right was that they would be able to, they would be given obedience in their household. And this is something natural. In the same way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has has created in women a greater, in their constitution, the ability to give birth to children, and all they have to go to in terms of giving birth and raising the children. And so therefore, since they had this great obligation upon them, and they were best suited for this in the way that Allah created them, they also, in return, got the greater right, where the obedience of the child is to his mother first before his father. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, when he was asked by one of his companions, whom should I befriend in this world? And the Prophet ﷺ said, your mother. Then he asked again, he said, your mother. Then he asked again, he said, your mother. And then he said, your father. So in both examples you find that the males have because the way Allah created them, they had certain obligations, so in turn, they received certain rights because of that. And women had certain obligations because of the way Allah created them, and so they got also, because of those obligations, they got certain rights and were awarded certain rights because of that. And this is all from Allah's wisdom. One cannot say that one is good, as I said, or evil, but that rather this difference is there and is needed in order for life to continue, life to exist. In the same way that if it was only nighttime, no life would exist on earth. If it was only constantly dark. And likewise, if it was constantly sunlight, life would not exist on the earth. And so therefore, both sexes are, have a complementary role. And if we understand this from the basic principle, then all the different regulations in Islam where men and women differ is based upon this notion of fulfilling their roles and their obligations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has disposed or discharged to each group. And to stand up and to find question with that is really to find argument and to find question with Allah, the Creator Himself. I mean, it would be the same way as for somebody to question as to why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create him of this color, or why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create him of this height, or gave him these many years to live, or gave him these type of physical characteristics or qualities. These are all things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does out of His wisdom, and He shows no injustice to His creatures, but rather He dispenses from His merit and His blessings as He wills. And therefore, in these matters, to find a problem with it is to really, in the end, although people might not necessarily see that when they look at it from a very, just take a quick glance at it, but if you really contemplate it, you find that in the end, people are taking, argument with Allah Azza wa Jalla as to why did He create it this way, why did He command these ways. And as we know, He is our Creator, He commands us, and He questions us and whether we fulfill His commands, and we are His slaves and His servants. We do not question Him, but rather we are to submit to His commands and to His orders. Now, with this sort of introduction to the topic, it is important to understand that at the same time and recognize that throughout the Muslim world, one does not find the teachings of Islam with regards to women applied, but rather one finds women in a very bad state, and this is undeniable. One cannot deny this. And if somebody was to ask me why, I would answer very clearly that in the Islamic world, all the rights are not observed. I mean, whether it's the rights of Allah Azza wa Jal, that only He should be worshipped and He should be obeyed, you find the society is not fulfilling those rights. And whether it's the rights of fellow Muslims one to the other, they're not also observed. And when it rights to the plants and to the animals and so forth are not observed either. So what happens is when a society does not observe its rights and does not check injustice and check tyranny and spread justice and decency amongst the members of that society, the strong end up devouring the weak. And typically in societies, women and children, the aged and so forth, are weak members of the society. So therefore the onus or the great burden of injustice, then comes upon them in disproportionate in a disproportionate manner. And so therefore it's, when one looks at the injustice meted out to women in the Islamic world, one should understand that this is not something which is unique to women. I mean, injustice and tyranny and the lack and the respect of rights and each other is something which the Muslims as a whole, as a society, as a culture, as a civilization, have lost. And so therefore, you have a situation of where the strong devour the weak, and since the strong devour the weak, the weaker members of the society, like the elderly, like the poor, like women, like children, anybody who doesn't have the ability to cause himself injustice, then becomes a recipient of injustice and faces much turmoil in their lives. And with that, it's important that we also, to conclude, that when addressing this topic, because it is a topic which is raised, and you can't go to any bookstore except you find a lot of books, or you can't, a week will not pass unless there be some television program or some, newspaper article or magazine article talking about women in Islam and how women are being treated injustice. The way to approach this is not to approach it in a apologetic manner, but the way to approach it is that one should see really how the reason as to why this occurs. That now the movement in the West is to wipe out any difference between men and women. That's a reaction for the extremism they had before when they considered women not to be full human beings. And that in Islam, we recognize the full humanity of both, and at the same time we recognize that each have their own roles based upon the way Allah created them and commanded them. And that not necessarily means that one is better than the other. Moreover, it is important to understand that when these voices are being raised for a reinterpretation of Islamic thought and so forth, one has to be very careful as to what is really behind that. A lot of it is really just taking the notions of Western feminists and just trying to find some sort of Islamic, cover to it in order to pass it off between the Muslims. And finally, if somebody was to say that, what is the proof that Islam is better to women? You argue that, you say that your Quran teaches you that, you say that the teachings of your Prophet Muhammad ﷺ teaches that, but we don't find any distinction between the women of your societies, Muslim societies. In fact, we consider them to be worse off. How would somebody respond to that? Well, one would respond to that by saying the greatest evidence is history itself. The greatest evidence is in if we're to look at, what has Islam brought to women as opposed to what has other civilizations brought to women. If you look at history, historians will tell you that humanity has seen about 15 or 20 civilizations. They differ in terms of their numbers. In all the civilizations, you do not find women having any role per se in the development of that civilization. For instance, if you look at the great events of our time in the American Revolution. The American Revolution we have the founding fathers, for instance. The French Revolution, we have certain French philosophers, Rousseau and others. You look at the ancient Greeks; they're all male philosophers. You look at any of the ancient Chinese, the ancient Japanese, the Hindus, and so forth. Any of these civilizations, you do not find women having any role in it. In fact, if you were to look at some of the books that are that you can find in the public bookstores and so forth, like the history of the world from a women's point of view and so forth, you only find in the last 50 or 100 years. They give you the history of women for the last 4,000 or 5,000 or 7,000 years of recorded history, and then there's nothing for the first 6,500 years. Then only in the last 150 years, do you find events. Well, this woman, she became a doctor, and this woman was elected for office, and she discovered this and so forth. So what it means is that for them, in their whole civilization, there was nothing in any part of the world which really affected women. Women were just really passive objects of all those civilizations. But in Islam, we find something completely different. First of all, we should remember that Islamic civilization is not a man-made civilization, but it's a revelation which was sent down by Allah Azza wa Jal. And if you look at it, we have the Prophet, but look who took the knowledge from that Prophet, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and spread it amongst the people. You find that amongst the major people around the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, in the beginning of his mission, one of the most important personalities around him was his wife Khadija, radiallahu anha. And had it not been for her support, both morally and also materially, the Prophet ﷺ's message could not have continued in Mecca. Likewise, you find afterwards, when Islam began to spread and so forth, and after the Prophet ﷺ's death, the knowledge of Islam, which is the foundation of Islamic civilization, we find it transmitted by one of the major people who transmitted to us. This is one of the Prophet's wives, Aisha radiallahu anha. So among the 7 major narrators of the Prophet ﷺ's hadith, to which you might say, close to maybe 70% of the hadith have been narrated from these 7 people or more, Aisha is amongst the major 2 or 3. Likewise, she's probably third. Likewise, you find in terms of the fatwa, the legal pronouncements, given in terms. So this is the actual interpretation of the Quran and the Hadith. We find amongst the few Sahaba who gave fatwa, Aisha was among the major scholars who gave a fatwa, and indeed we find some of the scholars centuries later, even wrote one scholar, Zarkashi, wrote a book about how many times, or citing different cases where Aisha, corrected the fatwa of other Sahaba. And where the other Sahaba, maybe another companion of Prophet ﷺ, after his death gave a legal pronouncement regarding an issue, and Aisha said, no, you're incorrect, the correct response, the correct opinion should be such and such. And there's a number of cases for this, and it was even gathered in a volume by Zarkashi, irrespective of Aisha, whether in her, amending the other companions' legal point of view, whether she was correct or incorrect. The point is the fact that she actually, participated in this. Likewise, you find throughout Islamic history, until very late in the last 2 or 3 centuries, most major scholars had among their teachers a woman. Ibn Taymiyyah, who was, in the 8th century of Islamic history, he had, if you look at the number of people he learned from, 3 or 4 were women. So it was not something which was uncommon to find, in Islamic history, even in what would be over here in the West called the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, where you had women who were teaching Muslims, and there are many books you can find and articles written in English showing the role of women in transmitting Islamic knowledge. And so therefore, a major part of society is, we find, in terms of the Islamic civilization of women. Likewise, in terms of knowing who women were. In Western civilization, or in Hindu civilization, or in Chinese civilization, we lack biographies of women personalities. We don't know much about them. And the biographies which we do have of women are all contemporary women since the change, but for these civilizations, some of them extending for thousands of years, there are really no biographies of their women. But if you look at just the biographies of, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, some of his companions, you find, among his companions to which we have biographies upon, which are about 9,000, you find a whole section of women. And so therefore Ibn Hajar, who gathered the biographies of the Prophet's companions, and is considered the greatest book on that topic, in 4 volumes. The last volume is dedicated only to the female companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And I guess maybe some of you have seen a book which was translated to English called The Women of Medina, which is basically excerpted from one of the other books of biographies, the Tabaqat of Ibn Sa'd, the section of the women, female companions of the Prophet ﷺ. Likewise, in terms of putting it in a practical, which is basically excerpted from one of the other books of biographies, the Tabaqat of Ibn Sa'd, the section of the women, female companions of the Prophet ﷺ. Likewise, in terms of putting it in a practical sense, we know that that among the great aims that is mentioned today for women's rights is a document which appeared by the United Nations a few years ago, and in 1995 they also had a conference in China, in Beijing, China, the World Conference on Women in Beijing, China. Now, it's very interesting. They consider the document which was concerning women's rights, which was released before that in the early 80s, to be the greatest document preserving women's rights. Just like they consider the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which came in the late 40s, early 50s, to be the greatest document produced by humanity on human rights as a whole. If you look at it, those documents really are not worth the paper they're written on. And we can give 2 examples for that. The first document, the older of the 2 documents, the one on human rights, which appeared at the end of World War II, came out because of the great, slaughter of innocent human beings that occurred on this European continent during World War II and elsewhere throughout the earth. The Jews were slaughtered in large numbers, the Gypsies, and so forth. I mean, there was a great slaughter of a lot of innocent human beings. So they came across with this charter for human rights in 1945. 50 years later, in 1995, you find, in 49, excuse me, less than 50 years later, in 1995, you find in Europe the slaughter of the Bosnians. And the document itself on human rights was unable to, even though all these countries were signatories to it, they were really unable to enforce it. And this type of slaughter of a whole population, occurred here on European soil itself, and yet the document itself wasn't able to lift that oppression from them. And likewise, you find, in terms of the document regarding women's rights, which came out in the 80s, likewise you find also their inability to apply anything from that. Because in 1995, when they had their conference in China, one of the practices of the Chinese government is to limit its population to one child. And as a result, most Chinese then therefore, because of their cultural preferences, prefer male children. And so if they have a female child, they will go about and commit infanticide to that child. And yet the United Nations couldn't say anything to the host country regarding that matter. They couldn't raise the issue. They couldn't discuss it. They didn't want to hurt the feelings of the Chinese and so forth. And yet there was a conference about women and the girl child. And here is a country which has legalized abortion, and as a result had great numbers, millions of people, millions of young girls in female infanticide. But look at what happened in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Arabs during the Prophet ﷺ's time practiced female infanticide. And in fact, one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, came to the Prophet upon his becoming a Muslim, informing the Prophet ﷺ that he had killed over 20 of his girl children before he became a Muslim, and he was asking, whether Allah would forgive him that sin or not. We find that the Prophet ﷺ, the teachings that he came with, and the way he practiced, that within 20 years of the Prophet ﷺ's teaching and his prophethood, within 20 years, this practice, which the Arabs were deeply rooted in, completely came to an end. No incident thereafter is ever recorded of female infanticide being practiced by the Arabs in Arabia. And so therefore, this shows practically it shows how that Islam, when applied in his teachings, actually removed, an evil which occurred. And there are other examples, but really the time doesn't allow me to get into that. So I guess in summary, it's just important for us to know where did feminism come out as a school of thought, what led to the feminist movement here in the West, what is the viewpoint that feminists have towards religion in general, and how these notions are being now transmitted to the Muslims, and how does Islam look at the notion of men and women, and how Islam has practically raised the status of women, while none of these civilizations have anything to really of value to mention regarding the role of women in their civilizations, or have done much to lift the plight of women in terms of a civilizational status. And with that, I hope I was able to convey at least the main ideas behind this lecture.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. I think to be practical, since Salat al-Maghrib is in about 6 minutes from now,
okay.
We have a bunch of questions, and I would suggest that we will answer them after Salat al-Maghrib from the masjid, the microphone, and after that we shall go and be available for the phone. Okay?
Okay, sure.
Jazakallah khair. وبارك الله فيكم, sisters, for listening. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it of benefit from what the Shaykh has said to the lecture, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward him for his effort to benefit us on this topic. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. نستمر في هذا الدرس الذي هو تكملة لدرس الأخوات حيث ستكون عبارة عن جلسة لمدة فترة يعني أقصى شيء نصف ساعة للإجابة على أسئلة الأخوات بخصوص محاضرة Feminism and Islam. This is a continuation to the lecture just being presented before Salat al-Maghrib, Feminism and Islam, presented by Sheikh Ali Tamimi. Now we have about half an hour, inshallah, to answer the questions raised by the sisters. Jazakumullah khair. Leave the microphone for Sheikh Ali Tamimi.
Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ba'd. The first question the sister asks, I find that one of the reasons for women not accepting Islam is because of the bad treatment of women by Muslim men. Do you not think that men should be educated as well as men, or I guess as well as women, since most Muslim men misuse their authority? Yes, I mean, it's obvious, as the sister mentioned, that our actions, whether, actions performed by men or women, often turns non-believers away from Islam, and every Muslim should obey Allah and fear Him as He deserves to be feared. And part of that is that we need to educate ourselves. Both women and men need to be educated regarding their mutual rights and obligations. Is it important for us to have female scholars, and how can a sister attain this level of knowledge? Yes, it is important that there are qualified scholars among women in order to be able better to teach other women and to be able to answer the questions of other women. Of course, that they don't have the restrictions that men would have, and more time could then be given to sisters to learn the religion if there were qualified female teachers and scholars. How could a sister attain this level of knowledge? Well, it's the same as with a brother trying to attain scholarship. I mean, the process is a rigorous one. It takes a number of years. It takes also a degree of worship of Allah and piety in order to be blessed by Allah to hold this type of knowledge. And so, I mean, the way that a male would seek knowledge is similar to the way a female would seek knowledge in its essence. And it usually begins with knowledge of the Quran, the Hadith, knowledge of fiqh, and then one graduates from level on level until one attains scholarship. It is believed by some non-Muslims that Muslim women have no rights, maybe because of some of our culture, so much so that people often feel sorry for you when they see a woman dressed Islamically. It is sad also to see some Muslim brothers, something, I can't read the writing, but some sort of reply to the sisters as feminists because they demand their rights and dwellings, mahar, etc. Please comment. Well, that non-Muslims use the criteria to see that if they see a sister dressed Islamically, that they feel sorry for her, they feel it's oppressed. This is because they consider freedom to be naked. And so if you're wearing clothes and you're modest and you're chaste, they consider this to be oppression. And this is because their yardstick, which they use to measure rights and or what oppression is and justice is obviously a yardstick which is based upon them following their desires. The real oppression is that women, in order for them to succeed in the West, they have to be pretty and they have to flaunt their bodies in order to attract attention to men, and they have to often engage in activities which they would not want to engage in given they had the choice in order for them to succeed and climb in society. And so the ones who are really oppressed are women who are reduced to just objects, sexual objects in Western society. That it's, as far as the sister saying that Muslim brothers will, when sisters demand their rights, as calling them feminists because they demand their rights in dwellings and mahar and so forth, these brothers need to fear Allah Azza wa Jal, as the sister has described, because obviously if a sister demands her right which was accorded to her from by Allah Azza wa Jal and His Prophet, no brother may deny that right from her in the first place, and secondly, to then belittle her and to accuse her of being a feminist, which in many cases feminists are really outside the fold of Islam, is just an additional sin which the person should avoid. Could the speaker please comment on the difference or style, and means of dawah between men and women? Is there a difference? If so, for what reason? Some say sisters should not partake in da'wah. Well, in general, there's no difference regarding the style or the means of da'wah between brothers and sisters. They are commanded both by the Quran to call unto their Lord, "Id'u ila sabi rabbika bil hikmati," call unto the path of your Lord with wisdom, wal maw'idati al hasana, fair preaching, wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan, and argue with them in a manner which is best. So, in terms of the means, this is the same for both men and women. And likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, telling the Prophet to say to humanity, "Qul hadhihi sabili," say this is my path, "Ad'u ila Allahi ala basira," I call unto Allah upon sure-sightedness, "Ana wa man ittaba'ani," I and whoever follows me. So whoever follows the Prophet ﷺ calls unto Allah with sure-sightedness, and here his follower might be either a male or a female. There's no difference in that. However, there are some differences in the sense that men can address both men and women, but women should not address men unless there is a need for it. In others, meaning that if the knowledge sought is found amongst men, then there's no reason for a woman to impart that knowledge to the men. They should seek it only from men. But for women, they can seek it from both men and women equally. And that is because of the problems of intermixing. And when the Sahaba did used to go to Aisha radiallahu anha or any of the other wives of the Prophet seeking some sort of question, answer to their question, it was only because they did not find that answer amongst the males of the society. As far as those people who say that sisters should not partake in da'wah, that is incorrect. Sisters are required to partake in da'wah because they fall under the obligation like men do. However, though, perhaps the people who are saying that sisters should not do what brothers do in da'wah, like traveling, and they should not intermingle or give public lectures because of the requirements of hijab, because of the requirements of having a mahram when they travel and so forth. The sister writes, I would like to know about divorce. Is it the right that men can divorce without a reason? And are women able to obtain a khul'a without giving a reason? Or are they obliged to? And if they have to give a reason, could you explain this, please? Well, first of all, what you understand, marriage is a contract. And it's a contract between two parties. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed that both parties can disengage from that contract in a certain way. As for our men, the way they disengage from that contract is through talaq, which is often translated as divorce. And here, talaq is something which is disliked in Islam in general. Something which, there is a hadith, although the hadith has weakness, that the most disliked of the halal, the most hated of the halal before Allah Azza wa Jal is divorce. And so in general, talaq, divorce, is considered something disliked and despised in the Sharia. And likewise, women can step out of this contract by means which is known as khul'a. And likewise, khul'a is disliked, but is permitted. The Prophet ﷺ said that it is permitted for women if they dislike, or the scholars have said, basing upon the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, that it's permitted for women to disengage from the marriage contract if she dislikes her husband's appearance or her husband's character. But likewise, the Prophet ﷺ informed us that if a woman seeks to disengage from the marriage contract without justification, she would not smell the scent of paradise, because it's sinful to divorce or to disengage from the marriage contract just because somebody wants to. It causes a great harmful effect within the family, within society as a whole. Does the woman, if she asks for a khul'a, required to state the reason why she wants to give the khul'a? She doesn't have required to state the reason. But it's always good, for instance, when people who have been married do decide to end that relationship between one another, that they try to give justification in order to help, ease or to help allow that disengagement to occur in a more peaceful manner. If somebody was just to come and to his wife and just divorce her and not give her any reason, you might leave a very bad impact. And likewise, if a sister was to ask khul'a for her husband without explaining why, he would also, could result in a very negative impact. But in terms of in a pure legal sense, it's not required to state a reason, as far as I know, and Allah knows best. You say the rights of Muslim women are not given to them today because society does not adopt Islam properly. How can these injustices